Hi everyone, we are now in week 6 of human growth and lifespan development, and this week we are going to be covering two periods of development, young adulthood and middle adulthood. So let me first just go over those developmental periods a little bit. I'm going to cover what we're going to go through this week, and then we're going to talk about the rest of the video about cohabitation and marriage and marital quality and some of what research has pointed to with the effects of cohabitation on marriage. So, young adulthood is typically considered the period of development from about 18 to 35. Another term that's really relevant in this discussion is called emerging adulthood. That term was coined by someone named Jeffrey Arnett, and that focuses on the period of development from about 18 to 25. He has a lot of interesting work and really talks about this period as being an extended adolescence in industrialized countries where adolescents or emerging adults continue to explore and experiment and engage in lots of risky behaviors. But young adulthood is a bit of a broader brush and goes up to 35, and the middle adulthood goes from about 35 to 55. We're going to wrap up our course next week with week 7, which focuses on late adulthood, which is the end of the lifespan. So this week we're going to talk about several different things. The first thing we're going to talk about is the effects of social media on young adulthood. Now this is an area that is challenging to research because it is evolving so fast. It takes us as researchers time to get funding for studies and track participants and follow them longitudinally to understand some of these effects. And within that time process, social media has changed so much. Facebook 10 years ago is not what Facebook is today, and how it is used and utilized by different people has really shifted. But we're going to review some of what we do know in that area. We're going to talk about physical and cognitive development in young and middle adulthood. We're also going to talk about loss and gains in adulthood. Now, many people can see all of the development and changes that happen early in the lifespan. But once you get to the end of the lifespan, are you really still developing and changing and gaining, or is mostly what you're experiencing loss? So we're going to talk about that a bit in your readings. And then we'll talk about personality development and relationships in adulthood. Now, I was really thinking there's so many different topics that I could have covered in this period of adulthood that are so interesting to me. But what I decided to focus about was cohabitation and romantic relationships before marriage. Now, I assume that most of you in some way will be dealing with romantic couples in some capacity in your future career. And so I thought this information might be really helpful to you in that. So, cohabitation, when we use that phrase, that refers to non-marital living arrangement that involves a sexual relationship. So, if we want to understand family formation, cohabitation is a huge factor in relationships today. So let's begin by just talking about trends in cohabitation in our country and how they've changed over the past 30 years ago. So believe it or not, about 70% of marriages today are preceded by cohabitation. This means that for 70% of young people, their first experience is cohabitation rather than marriage. About a half of cohabiting couples at any time either marry or break up within 2 years of cohabiting. How have these rates changed over time? We have seen about a 10-fold increase in cohabitation from 1970 to now. So in 1970, Census Bureau reported there was about 500,000 cohabiting couples, whereas today there's about 5.1 million cohabiting couples. And there's no reason to think that these trends are not going to continue to increase. So one study asked high school senior boys and girls the question, is it usually a good idea for a couple to live together before getting married in order to find out if they really get along? And in this study, 66% of boys and 61% of high school senior girls said that they very much agreed with that statement. So these trends are most likely not going to be changing anytime soon. Why are there these increases in cohabitation, these drastic increases over the past 40 years? First, the average age of first marriage continues to increase. At this point, we have about 25-year-old for girls and 27 for males, depending on what data you go with. There is also a decline in people who are just choosing to get married at all. There's more people who are choosing not to get married, and so cohabitation is how they engage in romantic relationships. Third, the sexual revolution has reduced some of the stigma attached to cohabitation. This was just something that was not socially acceptable in the 50s and 40s, whereas today many people are not as concerned with cohabitation as they were earlier in history. And fourth, there's a concern about continued high rates of divorce, which leads some couples to decide to cohabit for lots of different reasons. But those are some of the explanations of why cohabitation has increased so drastically. So when you look at cohabiting couples and married couples and you do research to kind of examine how are they the same and how they're different, there's some really interesting research. One is that cohabiting couples tend to have lower levels of personal happiness and higher levels of depression than married couples on average, looking across big samples of people. Of course, there's going to be individual differences. You're going to find some very happy cohabitors and some very miserable married people, but when you're looking at trends and data of big groups, we find those differences. We also find interestingly that cohabitors value independence more than married partners, and like to have more individual freedom. Cohabitors, probably not surprisingly, are less likely to be financially intertwined, so they're less likely to provide financial support for each other, more likely to keep finances separate than married couples. And also, probably not surprisingly, cohabitors tend to have more negative views about marriage than marital couples do. So, what are some characteristics of couples that do cohabit when we're just looking at that group together? We're going to delve into this more later, but the big finding here is that marriages preceded by cohabitation are more likely to end in divorce than marriages where you did not cohabit. This might not seem like a surprise finding for you, but I can tell you I have talked about cohabitation with lots of different groups of students, with the traditional college-age students of 18 to 22-year-olds, with all sorts of returning students at different schools I've taught at over the years. And this finding blows many students' minds, blows them out of the water, that the idea that cohabitation as practice for marriage doesn't actually lead to a less likelihood of divorce. Research consistently finds you're more likely to get divorced if you cohabit at first. Cohabitors, also not surprisingly, tend to score lower on religious behaviors, personal faith, church attendance, joint religious activities, all of which tend to have a stabilizing effect on marriage and increase marital quality and lead to less likelihood of divorce. And they find that married couples who cohabited prior to a divorce tend to have worse communication skills than couples that did not cohabit. So, why is it that couples who cohabit tend to have higher likelihood of divorce than couples who didn't cohabit? There's several different explanations for this in the literature that have been explored. The first has to do with what we call a selection perspective. And what we mean by that is that perhaps it's not cohabitation causing a higher likelihood of divorce, but maybe there's a third variable at play. So people who cohabit are more likely to get divorced, and they're also more likely to be associated with this other variable, and that might be actually what's driving it, not so much the direct association with cohabitation. So what could those third variables be? For example, individuals who have divorced parents are both more likely to cohabit and more likely to get divorced. So is it really the cohabitation, or is it that people who have divorced parents are more likely to cohabit and they're more likely to get divorced? That's one thing that's been explored. Individuals who cohabit tend to have a different commitment to an attitude about marriage. So is that what's really driving it? Is it that you have these ideas about what marriage should be and could be, and so based on those ideas, you're more likely to cohabit, more likely to get divorced? Are people self-selecting into cohabitation, have other characteristics in them that contribute to their marriages ending more than the cohabitation itself? So that's one explanation that's been explored in the research. The second explanation has to do with that it really is the experience of cohabitation that leads to this lower likelihood of marriage success. So I have a colleague with me at Penn State named Claire Kampdush, and she did some of this research. And some of what she found is that according to this perspective, cohabitation actually changes people and their relationships in ways that later undermine marital commitment and quality. So, for example, being in a relationship that is cohabiting has a less, many would say, although, again, if you talk to an individual couple, they may say something different, but there is a more uncertain commitment than for those who are in marital relationships. So, if you have that uncertain commitment, the idea is that perhaps you're going to invest less into the marriage and be more likely to divorce when you're later confronted with marital problems. That's the idea that's been explored. So what is true? Although there's support for both perspectives, there is more evidence supporting that it's the experience of cohabitation perspective rather than selection. So there really is something about choosing to cohabit that then undermines certain key aspects of a relationship that then play itself out if you do get married at the end of the cohabitation. It's important to remember that these two explanations are not mutually exclusive, though, and that they can be true both at the same time. So the selection perspective may predict why individuals tend to cohabit in the first place, and then the experience of cohabitation may predict the links between cohabitation and later marital quality. This is something that is continuing to be explored because, again, our attitudes about marriage and the norms in a culture around marriage are shifting. And so some of this research was done 10 years ago. Would it still hold today? We need to keep following these couples and families to really be able to understand that. And that research is being done. So the last thing that I want to end as we talk about cohabitation is that it's important to know that not all cohabitation is the same. And what I mean by that is people can cohabit for different lengths of time and for different reasons. Some people cohabit only after they get engaged. Some people plan to get married but have no formal engagement when they start cohabiting. Others cohabit with the idea that they're going to see whether marriage is going to be a good fit for them. It is kind of that test. Let's see if this is going to work. Whereas other people kind of fall into cohabiting without being super intentional about the choice. Our rent's going up in an apartment, and it would be really easy if we like lived together and saved money. And so these decisions kind of just evolve without some of the broader discussions about how it ties into marriage and engagement later on. So we can't necessarily lump all cohabiting couples together. Interestingly, they find that timing of cohabitation is really important in the research. So if a couple cohabited before they were engaged, their likelihood of divorce was even higher than couples who cohabited after an engagement. So I hope that gives you some food for thought in this topic of cohabitation that impacts so many different romantic relationships in our country today. As you go through the material this week, as always, email me if you have any questions or concerns. Thanks.